Welcome again to Shelby Stitcher. This is Joan Parker. I am working on my half square triangle quilt that I've been showing reels on. And as I mentioned, I'm brand new to the YouTube world and it is very different from what I thought. And everywhere I turn, there's something else I don't know. But I wanted to share some things that I've learned. And this seems to be the best venue for doing that because of the pictures and voice and all that. So what I'm doing is, if you watched my first reels about this quilt, you saw that I laid all the blocks out and I added one to each row, and now I'm folding it down and adding the horizontal seams. I have the first 3 seams done, and so I'm just flipping down the whole quilt and hoping you can see this. I'm taking the block intersections and nesting them against each other, and I'm turning them so that they nest closely, and then I'm putting a pin on what will be the leading seam going under my needle. Now if you look down here, I'm going to flatten this seam down and iron it like I have done up here. See how I purposely put a fold in there? That's because this side of the block is pieced and this side is not. It's going to tend to want to fold that way, but then this one's going to tend to want to fold that way. So I just smash it down the middle and iron it and put my wooden clapper on it. My husband made this for me. This is just a piece of probably 8-inch square wood that's about 1 inch thick, that's a pine, and he countersunk a hole in the back so it doesn't touch my fabric. And then I put an old cabinet handle on the top so I can just pick it up. If you have not used a clapper before, they work beautifully. They just pull all of the heat out of your fabric and they leave what you just pressed so flat. I thought it was just one of those things I would never be interested in having. But then after he made me one and I've been using it for a while, I find that I really enjoy having one. So here's what I do. I take my seam and I turn it so that it's nesting. I put one at the end of the row, one in the seam, and then one in the middle. I'm going to do the same thing here. And see how the strings, from when I sewed them together originally, are still holding them in place. That's the reason for putting a couple extra stitches in there. So I line that up, hold it with my thumb, and then I pin down through. Something about pins, and I'm also going to pin in halfway through. And while I'm doing this, I check on the back to make sure that my seam allowance is going the right direction, because I happen to be pinning through that when I'm pinning about halfway along. Pins. There are all kinds of sewing pins, and I am certainly not one to get every last little new or perfect thing. A little bit about myself. Let me finish telling you about the pins first of all. These have a very thin shaft and they have a glass head. So the thin shaft makes them slide easily through these multiple layers of fabric. I'm looking here. I'm not going through, well, I'm going through 2 most of the time in the middle of the block, two layers of fabric. But at this intersection, I'm going through 4. Sometimes in the intersections I'm going through 8, depending on if it's the one that has a lot of the seam allowances or not very many. But the thin shafted needles tend to just glide right in there, and I think it's because they're so thin. I'm very particular about some things and not very particular about others. I'm pinning very carefully, and you'll see when I go through and sew this row that I'm sewing very slowly, and I'm not rushing things. I'm stopping at every little intersection that needs a little bit extra TLC and just guiding my way through that. Now here's a place where there's 6 layers of fabric, and I don't go straight down in, but I go sort of at an angle just a little bit so I don't twist those fabrics. And again, I'm feeling on the back because there's a seam right behind my pin. When I first started quilting, I was following somebody who did sort of a quilt cam kind of thing. They just showed themselves sewing and they would talk about the project they were working on and other things that were going on in their life. And I didn't know anybody else that quilted at the time, that pieced. So I would watch her videos, and even though I couldn't respond, I felt like I was getting to know her, and I was very eager to just soak up any little tidbits of quilting that I could. And I think I did learn a lot from her because I still do a lot of the same things she was showing and she was doing. Let me see if that looks better. Lift it up a little bit. Maybe it does. I have a slimline light, that's what this is, across my sewing machine, and I am 62 and I've worn glasses since I was, I think, 12, and I have a hard time sewing without really good lighting. And my sewing machine, of course, has a light under the opening there, whatever that's called, the arm, but it's just not as bright as I would like. And I got this slimline light that clamps onto the end of my sewing table when I had my last sewing machine, because I had changed out the bulb in my sewing machine light that's under here. Well, the bulb is actually in this part, and it shines down on next to my needle. I think I had I'd changed that light bulb at least 4 times one year. I sew a lot, so I thought this would be a really good investment for me to get this light. Whoops, I just dropped my scissors in my trash can. But I thought in a way, deserved to have a really good light, so I bought the slimline because I saw it on somebody else's reel, somebody else that I watched. So maybe you're not like me in that you wouldn't enjoy watching somebody sew, but I just thought of another woman, the lady who I saw using the slimline light, that she had kind of did the same thing. She was showing how to make a certain block, and I already knew how to make the block, but I, at the time, was really interested in her lifestyle and what she had going on, so I just watched along as she was sewing, and she always had this slim light lamp on, which I thought was just super cool. And it is somewhat expensive, but it's worth it, and it's an LED light. Well, now that I have my new sewing machine, which is just the upgraded model of the last one, I had a Janome 6500, and this is a 6700, so it's just like the big sister to the one I just replaced. I'd had that machine for over 20 years, but I do sew quite a bit. Both of my grandmothers sewed, and I'm 62, so I'm not a young girl, but my father's mother sewed everything for her home. She sewed pillows, curtains, that type of thing. My mother's mother, and this was so unusual back in her time, but when I was like in grade school age, which would have been in the late 60s, she had a home business, and she sewed wedding dresses and bridal gowns for an entire wedding. And then, I don't remember what year it was, but later she actually started making suits for men. So she had so many skills with working with those really delicate and slippery and beautiful fabrics. And she made many a wedding gown, and I would love to go and spend time at her house. And she never taught me to sew. My other grandmother taught me how to sew on her treadle sewing machine, and I have her treadle sewing machine right now. I don't sew on it anymore because the belt broke right after it was given to me, but the belt broke right after that. But I would watch my other grandmother and the meticulous way she sewed everything, because she was working with the satins and sateen and chiffon and just all those just wildly difficult to work with fabrics. Okay, now as I'm sewing, I'm going to use my seam ripper that I showed yesterday, just a cheapo Dritz seam ripper. And the reason I like this is because it doesn't roll off the table when I set it down, and it is very inexpensive to replace. I use it for a seam ripper when I need to do that. However, what I usually use it for is as a stiletto to make sure my seams stay down. And again, I'm sewing very, very slowly for a couple reasons. I don't want to go over the pins, so I stop and make sure I pull my pin out. And on these pieced sections of my block, the back of the same section is pieced, and I want to stop and make sure that all of those seams are going in the right direction. And if it's a particularly thick seam or a large seam and I get it flipped forward or flipped away from the feed dogs, I will go back and take that out, that little 1/2 inch section, and flip it around and sew it the right way. Another little idiosyncrasy about me is I always use a magnetic pin cushion. I love seeing all those cutesy pin cushions, that are filled with crushed walnut shells and that are made to look like a pig or a snowflake or a trumpet swan or whatever your pin cushion is sewed to look like. However, these magnetic ones, I love just being able to toss my pin toward it and knowing that it's going in and not taking the time to stop and stick the pin down in the pin cushion. Now, you can do whatever you want, but that's just something that I do not sew without. And these fat seams that have 6 or 8 layers, I'm pushing them down with my seam ripper just to make sure they go smoothly under my foot. And there's the beginning of that seam, so I'll take that pin out. And this has been fun to do. It has been a real adventure to learn how to upload reels to YouTube. And if you go back and look at my other reels, you will see that I developed, I don't know if that's even the right word, I came up with a thumbnail that I could put on all of my videos so that when somebody is looking for my videos, they can look at my little 4-year-old looking thumbnail. It just has my name, Joan Parker, and Shelby Stitcher, which is my handle on Instagram and is now going to be my handle on YouTube. And they can identify my reels from my thumbnail picture. I do have a 4-year-old granddaughter, and we love to color and paint and use all the glitter and everything together. She's so fun. A couple weeks ago, we had a missions team from our church that came back from Spain. And when they got home, I'm sure it was the long traveling and the time difference, and they did really incredibly hard physical labor while they were there. They were mixing cement and digging trenches for a spring to run through, or putting piping for a spring to get water down the hill, and they poured lots of cement, did lots of digging, and they were exhausted. And I think there were 5 different people that came back from that trip ill, and it was an upper respiratory infection type thing. And of course they flew back on a plane, and they weren't sick while they were traveling, but the next day they were all down. So I had my granddaughter here that day, or I asked my daughter if she could come over, and she said yes. And so while I drew some cards that just said "get well soon," and or something along those lines, she was coloring the pictures while I was making a huge double batch of homemade beef vegetable soup. And after the soup cooled, we packaged everything up, and we stopped at the store and bought a big box of crackers to go with each one. And it took us about 4 hours to go to 5 different houses and deliver our cards and soup. But she loved that so much. So after I developed my thumbnail picture, I thought, that looks like something my granddaughter would have colored. It just looks so juvenile, but it gets the job done. And I don't see myself becoming a famous YouTuber or having all those, glitzy things. I'm not going to wear special hats and do crazy things just to get people's attention, which is what I see a lot of people doing on YouTube, and that's just not me. I love to sew. I love to spend time with my family. I love to do things for other people, but sewing is just my mental health therapy for the day. I try to sew every day. I don't think there's hardly ever a day goes by that I don't sew at all, because I'm always working on a couple scrap quilts. I have several right now that I'm working on, and I just want to get this one off my design wall, but I wanted to get the blocks pieced into a center so I could show you how to web the top. And then once that's done, I don't want a stack of blocks just roaming around in my sewing room. I'd like to see some of the places that you are sewing out there in YouTube land. Our house is a ranch that has 4 bedrooms upstairs, the master bedroom, which is now my sewing room, and 3 very small bedrooms that are not much more than 10 by 10. We have 8 children who are grown and gone, but our house also has a basement with a garage under it. So when we first moved into this house nearly 20 years ago, my husband and I had the master bedroom, which has his and her closets, and it also has a full bathroom attached to it. And then downstairs was not finished. There was tile flooring, and there was heating and air conditioning, but there weren't any permanent walls except for around the bathroom. And so before we moved in, my husband did a lot of the work with a friend of ours from church, several friends of ours from our church. One man was a contractor, and he took out a wall between the kitchen and dining room so that we would have room for our table for 12. We have leaves in it, so we usually keep it set up for a very roomy 6-person table. But my husband moved here before the rest of our family did, because we did not have a functioning kitchen and laundry room. So I told him I'd be glad to move here as soon as that was all taken care of. So he went ahead and started working from here because he's been working from home for over 25 years. And so he would work, and then at the end of his work day, the contractor would come over because he also had another full-time job, and they would work together on different projects around the house. And it went very quickly, and I just love our house so much. So here's another row I just finished. This is the finished portion, and this is the next row I'm going to be adding on, if you can see that. I'm not going to do this right now, but I've been ironing every row as I go so I could see which way to fold the seam or press the seam. But what I'm going to do is just show you how I'm just going to go to the next row and pick up my next block so you can see where the threads are holding it together, like I showed you for how to sew it together. So I always start at the end that I'm going to finish on, and I drape that off to my right on my lap so that it's already pinned and ready to go, but it's not going to be in my way, and I'm not going to pull the pins out or have the pins dragging across me. So I pin the last seam intersection, and then I go down to the end and pin that seam, pin the seam down there, and then I just hold my fingers, and you can see there's 3 pieces on the back and there's 3 pieces in the front. The front ones, the seams go to the left, the back one, the seams are pressed to the right. So I just check, I can just feel with my finger of my left hand here and my thumb that there's no seam right behind that. And then I'm going to just be pulling the weight of this quilt top, which is all in my lap, over to the right. And I just find the next intersection, also butt those up against each other and nest those seams together, pinning on the left. And wow, this feels like a really thick seam. I can just tell there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers of fabric there. And then here is where my blue is pieced, so it's pretty close to where the middle is. So I'm going to purposely go through that seam and pin it down so that when I sew, it won't get pushed up the other way. So sometime soon, I will show a little tour of my quilting room. I think our 6th child had just moved out when I was setting up my sewing room. For a while there, I didn't sew, probably for a couple years when all of our children were home and various and sundry things were happening. I didn't sew for a couple years because when we made our basement into an apartment for one of our daughters, and she lived with us for a little while, and I packed up all my sewing things when we were having the construction done to make our wide open basement into a large bedroom, bathroom, and storage room for her. And then after she moved out and my 6th child, so children 1 through 6 had just moved out, not just, but they were all moved out, either married or living on their own or in college or whatever. And I fixed the drywall and repainted my 6th child's room. And my husband said, why don't you make that your sewing room, because that way you'll have all your things in one place. Well, I have been very blessed with lots of donations of fabric, and I couldn't fit everything in that little 10-foot square room, mostly because I also do machine quilting for other people. I do not have a long arm machine, but I have an HQ16, which has a 16-inch throat, but it's not quite as large as a lot of, when you think of a long arming machine. Mine does not have all those bells and whistles, but I love it. I've used it many, many, many times. I have quilted hundreds of quilts for myself and others, and it doesn't have a computerized, like a digitalized feature on it, which I think would be fabulous, but it's so expensive. It would be over $10,000 to add that to the machine I have. I didn't pay anywhere near that for the whole machine and frame anyway, so that just seemed like a waste of money to me, because I do free motion edge-to-edge quilting. I do just a little bit of custom quilting if it's in a big triangle or in the border or something like that, but I'm very content with what I can do. And that frame and its accessories and all those things take up quite the large amount of space. In fact, we had the quilt frame in our living room behind the couch for years, and nobody ever asked what it was or even mentioned it. It was sort of just out of the way because of the way the room was situated. But now that I have the handy quilter, which I think I've had it for 15 years or so, we left this in the basement, and it seemed like every time I was downstairs sewing after my daughter moved out, whatever I needed was upstairs, and whenever I was upstairs, whatever I needed was downstairs. And so, again, fast forward to when our 6th child moved out. When he moved out and I repaired his walls and, you know, just filled in holes and things like that. And then primed and painted his bedroom. And then my husband said, oh, this would be a good place for you to sew. And it was a very cheerful room, and it was very well laid out as far as where I had my sewing machine and ironing board and all those things. But eventually, and this was completely his idea, I tell you, he is really a keeper. One day he just suggested that I use our master bedroom with the bathroom and closets right here for my sewing studio. So he moved my quilt frame upstairs to this room, and it's along the wall behind me. I'll show you that sometime in the future, save that for another video, because I want to get this done. And then if you notice my table, my sewing machine is flush with the top of my table, the bed of my machine. This was a table from IKEA. My husband drew a template of my sewing machine and used a jigsaw and cut it out. And then he made a frame underneath to support my sewing machine. That was just really cool. And I got that idea from somebody online. I forget who it was, but back in the day, I showed him that this woman her husband had done this exact thing for her. And I told him, you could do that for me if you tried. And he did a great job. So my last machine was the same brand as this one, and this one is the next one in that line. I don't know what you would call it, a big sister to that one or whatever, but it's almost the same shape. It's just the teensiest bit bigger where it goes down through the table. So he had to just cut out about another 1/8 of an inch or so to make this one fit. And that was really helpful, especially when I first started sewing to make extra income, because I would machine quilt on my other Janome for customers, and that was really a struggle. If you've ever done your own quilting, you know that keeping the layers sturdy and stable while you're sewing is the hardest part, and it's so hard on your shoulders and back. But this machine has a larger arm than the standard domestic machine, and when you're sewing and you're doing any machine quilting, that is really handy. I'm going to show you up close what I'm doing here if you can see it. Right here, there's one, just the teensiest bit of this brown color showing on the other side. And I can see that if I take this piece of brown off, which just adds a lot of bulk right there at that seam. Do you see how I just pulled that off? When I fold this seam allowance of the bright blue open, it more than covers all of that area that I need. And it was only 2 stitches from the corner into the block. So I can, if I hold that carefully as I sew it, there'll be no risk of that coming apart. And I'm just going to trim this to the size that I need. There you go. So can you see that I just ripped out those last 2 stitches and tore that brown piece off? Not because the color would be so distracting, but it would make it really bulky when I went to iron this seam open. So I'm pinning this side down. I'm going to go to about the middle and throw away my little scrap right there. If you're just starting to quilt, I think it's really important to have a good workspace set up. So this, of course, is where my sewing machine is. Underneath the tripod for my camera is my ironing station. And then I have a big trash can to my right. And I just keep throwing things in there. That's my place. I don't have to really try real hard because it's the only thing down there. So again, I use my seam ripper to hold that seam down as I started, and then I'm using this little belly button on my sewing machine, which does 4 stitches in one place, which is really handy. That's for if you're using thin fancy dress fabrics, it doesn't suck it down into the feed dogs. But I also have this leader ender back here. I don't know if you can see that on the camera very well, but I'm starting and ending with that right now because I do give it a gentle little tug when I start the new seam, so that it doesn't get sucked down into the feed dogs. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, I'm going to explain it one more time. When you're first starting a seam, you want to have something under your foot of your machine that already has the thread engaged in it. I'm teaching 2 young ladies to sew on Wednesdays. It'll be tomorrow. And here I'm going to cut off this leader, and you see it's just 2 triangles that I had that were scraps. So I'm teaching these 2 young ladies how to sew, and one of the most important things to me is to get them to develop good habits. And I told them you either need to be holding both of your threads when you start a seam, or you need to have them already embedded in something else. And I do a lot of assembly line sewing, and in the future I hope to do a recording, or I'm sorry, I'm old, I say recording. I'm hoping to do another installment on my YouTube channel of how you assembly line sew and why you should do that. For one reason, you don't have those loose threads. If you've ever done garment sewing, and that's what I started sewing when I was a young girl, you know that you have to backstitch at the beginning and end of your seams. Well, in quilting we don't do that because there's usually another seam that's going to be going over it that will help to strengthen it. But every time you start sewing, when you are sewing a garment, you have to hold both threads together so that they don't get pulled down into your feed dogs or down into your bobbin case, and you end up with what looks like a bird's nest every time you start sewing. That is very common. It's very common that a lot of people don't know that, but I tell my students every time they get here, remember to hold your threads, remember to hold your threads. And we're starting by making a small quilted pillow, and I've given them both leaders and enders, or if we're trimming something up, I'll say, oh, save that to use as a leader ender, or just as they call them thread spiders or thread bunnies. So again, I'm going to very gently pull with my right hand as I'm going over this thick seam, and I'm guiding with my left hand very slowly to make sure these seams are really well done. So yeah, that's the little thread bunny secret. And I told you I quilt for people, and it's not uncommon that probably every other quilt that I get from customers have thread knots on the bottom all over their quilt tops on the underneath side, because they didn't know that little trick about holding both of your threads. Well, if you sew over a piece of fabric that you're just going to throw away later, that's holding your threads stable, so that serves that purpose. I was gifted large bunches of fabrics 4 different times in the past several months, well, going back to right before Christmas. I have so much fabric, but I like to get new fabric because it doesn't go with my fabric, and a lot of times it's just prettier than my fabric is. My sister and I sold Thimbleberry's fabric from our house for years, and I still have probably 30 bolts of it in my bedroom now. I moved it into there. If you aren't familiar with Thimbleberry's, it's beautiful fabric. It holds up so well. I have quilts that I made 25 years ago that look like brand new, that we've been using for years. They have a real longevity and stability and strength to the fabric. And the thing that it just has to be your thing, and it was my thing at the time. I like really dark country colors for my house to decorate with. My walls are all in off-white. Most of them are off-white. The color is called Dover white. But anyway, the Thimbleberries are super dark, and if you don't like them, you don't like them. And the thing is, they all go together with all the other Thimbleberries very well, because they all have an undertone of brown or black. And the creams, even the creams, are very dark, and they don't play well with other fabrics, other non-Thimbleberry fabrics. But when you've got a bunch of them, you can just pick any red and any green, any blue, and they'll just all play together nicely. So when I get fabrics from other people, usually, for one thing, they're very small amounts. I very rarely get even a half yard. They're usually small scraps. One of my friends, though, has given me several jelly rolls and charm packs, and that's just such a treasure. So somebody gave me the blue fabrics for this quilt that I'm working on now, and if you've seen my other videos, you know that I had a lot of strips of this black with the teal vine on it. So I made as many blocks as I could, and here's one block is this big. It's a half square triangle. I made all the blocks I could out of that fabric, and then I was fiddling around in my bullet journal trying to look at different layouts and how many blocks it would take. I had 120 blocks, which seems like, a million. But when I laid it out, it was only going to make something that would be good for like a toddler boy. It wouldn't even be big enough for a small bed quilt for, a grown child. So I looked I knew from the box that there were other blues that were cut to the same width, which was 3 3/4 inches. So I started planning and looking at what I could do with making different blocks. I keep a bullet journal. That's what this is. And you can see in this picture, I had my 120 blocks of the one blue, and I was trying to figure out, up here you can see on July 20th, and this is the number that I used to identify this quilt, number 173. I had 120 blocks total, which for a 10 by 12 setting, which would be using up all the blocks, was going to be 43 by 52. If I made a few more, if I set it 14 by 17 blocks, I would need 238 blocks. Well, I ended up setting it 14 by 16, which was 192 blocks, but that gave me a finished size of about 62 by 70. These numbers are for this setting. So down here is where I was seeing if I used the darkest blue for the corner block and use the blue with the hearts on it for these three, and then I could use these for the darkest ones. I could use all 120 of my original blocks and then add the other ones to it. So that's how I fool around with my settings. When I first started quilting, I always use patterns. I always follow them exactly, and they always turn out beautiful. But now that I have so much fabric, and it's hard to get rid of any of it. This year I have given away or sold big, gigantic amounts of it. I think the first time I went through my sewing room and took all the pieces that I had been saving, and I realized I just wasn't going to be using. Most of them were the darker Thimbleberries fabrics, and I gave a woman 2 of those big totes that are about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide and 3 feet high, and she was just starting to sew and she wanted scraps to play around with, so I gave those to her. And then I sold several big bundles of fabrics again to somebody that was just starting to quilt and wanted to get a little bit of a stash. And so I am getting rid of some. Here I'm getting to the very end of my row, so I'm going to hold my seam ripper here to make sure those don't turn in and that they don't come apart. And I'm going to get really close to the edge and do my lock stitch again. And sometimes I just see how this goes. I'm going to do my reverse stitch, and if it doesn't start backing up smoothly and nicely, oh it is, then I would just stop and just continue going forward so I don't get a big lump. Now my needle's down. I'm going to take my thread bunny and just put it under there, and I just stitch really close to the last row of stitching. I get all the way to the end, and I pull this forward and snip off, leaving my thread bunny under the machine. And I will leave that there until I start this row, and I'll put it at the end of the next row. So I think that was my 5th seam. Let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, it was my 5th seam. And I have 12 seams. No, I have 11 seams. So this is my 6th. So I'm on my way. I should finish this tonight. But it's been fun talking, and I hope if you have any questions, you'll feel free to answer them. I'll be glad to share whatever I know with you. And sometime soon, I'll give you a look around my sewing room to see how it's set up, how I store my fabric, where I put my threads, and all those type of things. If you have any questions that you want to know about beginning sewing or about scrappy sewing, that's what I do the most, feel free to leave a question in the comments, and I'll be glad to get back to you. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.